You are listening to Sirva Soundbites, the official podcast of Sirva, a leading global relocation management and moving services company. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome to Sirva Soundbites, where we aim to connect, inform, educate, and entertain our listeners. I'm Emma Dodwell-Groves, Senior Manager of Global Advisory Services at Sirva, and today we have a podcast favorite, Ray Rackham, here with us again. Ray is an expert in global immigration and compliance. Welcome back to Sirva Soundbites, Ray. Could you quickly introduce yourself for listeners that missed our last episode together?
Thanks so much, Emma. Hello, everyone. I'm Ray Rackham. Recently appointed co-chair of Newland Chase. I still have kept my client solutions, thought leadership role, but actually our new CEO has invited me to be the steward of our 2025 and beyond strategy and what it means to operate as a immigration service provider to corporations and individuals alike this year and heading towards 2030. So I'm very excited to be back.
It sounds like we have the perfect person on the podcast. I mean, you were the perfect person last time, but with your new snazzy, position, I think the fact that you're forward-looking, future navigation is exactly what we want to talk about here today. So perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We did last speak in October, I think, last year, and we talked about the impact at that stage of the super election year on immigration. And what we tried to do then was to help our listeners be prepared for the possible legislative and immigration shifts that might be coming as a result of some of those elections around the world. Since then, the US election has taken place, and many of the global leaders that won those elections last year have begun to implement their legislative and immigration changes that maybe previously were just election rhetoric and we didn't know what was going to happen. So now we have this opportunity to connect again and use immigration as a lens through which to look back on the super election year, reflect on what's actually happened, and consider next steps that global mobility will need to consider. So, as I said, you're the perfect person to talk about it. Let's start. I'll try and structure us through. Let's start with the elephant in the room. Trump won the US election. So let's start with the US. And immigration, we know, was a critical issue in his campaign. What's actually happened so far, and what do you anticipate in that space?
Oh my goodness, Emma, that is such a
Big guns.
question.
Yeah.
It really, I mean, if we think of the US really as a microcosm of example of what really happened throughout 2024 super election year. 74 countries in one way went to the polls, and the US seems to typify what happened in the vast majority of those elections. The incumbents were displaced. Those administrations that had been in place were either thrown out or weakened into kind of forms of coalition. We saw the advent of autocracy, of populism in the second half of last year. So many presidential elections came almost kind of week after week after week, and it really did have populist politics really at the forefront of everyone's mind. And not so much the elephant in the room, but the reality in the room now that immigration forms a central part of public policy the whole world over. And specifically thinking about the US, when we spoke last time, we talked very much about the conflation or the confusion of economic migration with asylum or undocumented migrants or those who were seeking migration to a country for humanitarian reasons or purposes. And we're seeing kind of those two sides of the coin very much in the immediacy of a Trump second term. Let's start with what we're interested in, the kind of economic migration, the simplification of H-1B.
Right, huge.
It's a huge thing. And we must remember that, these simplification procedures were announced prior to the inauguration, but led to an absolute uproar in what can be defined as President Trump's electoral base. The updated rules for H-1B simplification include a whole raft of things, but clarifying eligibility criteria, streamlining processes, and measures to ensure fairness and transparency. Now, that's according to the US Department of Homeland Security, the DHS. The negative response in the kind of the electorate, the base Trump supporters, was palpable. H-1B is a popular visa. It's been around for over 30 years, and it allows the US employers to temporarily offer foreign work nationals or migrant workers who are highly specialized and highly skilled to come and live and work in the US.
Right.
It's the irony of populist politics that I'm interested in here, because H-1B doesn't grant permanent residency automatically. And that seems to be the confusion in most of the electoral base. But we've seen an almost about turn from President Trump
Is
compared
that
to
a
his,
surprise? An about term?
well, depending on how you look at it. But we have seen this kind of flip, welcoming H-1B. And I think this is, I imagine, has been encouraged by his influential support in Silicon Valley, for example. But
Right.
the majority of H-1B visa applications come from India. About 7 out of 10 H-1B visa applicants are Indian nationals. And it's a very different take from Trump's kind of buy American, hire American
Yeah.
executive order in his first term, where President Trump is actually saying, we need H-1B workers. Now, that's caused a lot of scratching of heads in Trump's kind of base electorate,
Right.
who still very much adhere to the buy American, hire American kind of anti-free trade, anti-immigration lens. Then on the other side of that coin, we've seen immediately the
Yeah.
sustained approach, should I say, there I might even say attack on undocumented or illegal migrants with
Right.
the re-advent of ICE,
Mm-hmm.
and the deportations that we have already seen. So those two sides of the coin that we discussed at length last time
Yeah.
are really being played almost immediately. Day one
Before
after the
before
inauguration.
Trump came into power, they were already in
Yeah,
play. And
absolutely, and with those
I wonder, there's
raft of
also the
executive orders.
right, and that's the way he's going about things through
Mhm.
executive orders, which we've seen it before as well. Here's a part of the problem of modern day American politics. It's one, president comes in and puts in a whole bunch of executive orders, and the next one cancels them and starts a whole new set, which is why I think it was so important that we're all paying close attention, because these things can turn on a dime. These things can be done very quickly. They don't need to go through such slow, rigorous processes. You did make me
Absolutely.
think, though, not only about undocumented migrants, but also the birthright question. Are certain
Yeah,
people? I'm not sure the implications of that yet, but those two elements seem to be on that one side of the coin, as opposed to the idea we want skilled workers, we need skilled workers, and we'll get into the skilled shortage coming up a little bit later. But there is an awareness that that's the case, and you sort of need to find a place that it fits into anti-immigrant sentiment in some populism. So I think you're right that it's a real contradiction, real interesting one.
and depending on where you sit on the political spectrum, there are deep-rooted questions about the legitimacy of decisions that were considered to be enshrined within the Constitution.
Mm,
Um, and it's asking lots of questions around what were the founding fathers thinking when they put some of these things into place. And it's very similar, although entirely different, as we talk in oftentimes when we're thinking about super election year. But it's very similar to the discussions that are happening in the UK at the moment around the kind of electoral system, that
yeah,
the Reform Party only getting a handful of seats but having 14% of the vote share. That
yeah,
seems to be the traditional norms are being questioned. But I did want to mention it's quite timely that we're having this discussion now, because we are in the midst of political chaos in terms of tariffs. So even though H-1B, buy American, hire American debate is ongoing, now, if
yeah.
you want to sell it here, make it here is still very much part of the American political discourse.
Right.
And I don't know if you remember, Emma, but we talked a little bit about um, the possibility, or when President Trump was President-elect Trump, we were talking about the possibility of tearing up of multilateral agreements. And I made some
Right.
comment that what would that do to bilateral agreements? Would they be easy to be torn up? And we're going to start again, and we're going to use America as America PLC. I think we are
Mm,
seeing a little bit of that. And again, immigration, free trade, trade agreements, they all work in one ecosystem, which is part of the global economy. And we're
right.
seeing this live in action. It's a fascinating time to be interested in mobility and immigration.
Right. And I think so much of what you're saying, so there's the visas that people need, talent need to go in and out of the US, but organizations, our clients, and many of them are reconsidering their global supply chain based on these potential tariffs implications. The idea
They really are.
um, So a lot of our clients are thinking about this not just in regards to moving people with a particular type of visa, but their global supply chain, where they're making products, where they can move them to, and that means their workforce or their factories or their, shared service centers may need to relocate as well. So it's a really unstable time, and a lot of organizations, I think, were holding their breath and waiting, which is, I think, where we were at last time when we spoke, waiting to see what the US did and whether that would have global implications for them.
It is already having quite significant global implications for our clients.
Yeah,
And I think really is the demonstration of a globalized world, and mobility is not just about the ensuring someone can cross a border. Global mobility has always been considered to be the organization within an organization that does
yeah,
exactly that. Global mobility now needs to be thinking about a whole raft of other things that sit entirely outside and beyond what we traditionally believed was part of our remit. Um,
right.
it might
We've
sound
been hearing
scary,
a
but it also means that global mobility has a slightly larger and wider seat at the table now,
And that's what we've
which
been
itself
talking
is
about for years,
for
right? Like, and
years.
I think there was
Absolutely.
definitely post COVID, there was mobility will be in charge of extended business travelers and our remote work population because of those immigration understandings. And that seat at the table is something we've been looking for a really long time. So the opportunity, I think, arose post COVID. They were saying mobility will have more of a part to play in extended business travelers or in our remote work population because of those visa and immigration implications. When are you going to be taxed? When have you, spent too many days in a country
Mhm.
and causing immigration issues? And I think the conversation is hot on that again. It's back up. We're seeing choices towards commuters or to extended business travelers instead of assignments in some locations that might be considered a little politically risky because of all these shifts that have been happening.
Yep, absolutely. I
So
think
let's
the
widen. Oh,
interesting
sorry.
thing, sorry, I mean, I think the interesting thing that I would say from a kind of 30,000 feet perspective is we anticipated that mobility in the relocation industry seat would remain at the table after COVID. And there was that slight wane. Skill shortages are still very much a big thing, but there was
Yeah.
that where the business were, when I spoke to mobility professionals, they'd say, "Oh, it looks as though our seats being kind of pulled slightly to the left of the table now, or slightly to the right of the table." And what super election year has done is really put that seat very much squarely in the center again. And there's a lot of business uh, attention on the ability to move people quickly, safely, and
Right.
securely,
Because the
whilst
need
protecting
hasn't gone away.
business. Yeah,
Like
the
the
need, yeah,
complications there about doing it, are
yeah,
increasing, but the need is still there. So
absolutely.
let's sort of take a step back. I know we started on the US just because that was the big election that happened after we last spoke. And of course, a lot of countries, as we said, were waiting and watching to see where that went before they made some decisions. But let's look more at the global immigration landscape. Not everyone's doing exactly the same thing. Um, like you said, most elections went against incumbents, leaned towards the right generally, but all of them, whichever way they were leaning and whatever has happened since, kept immigration at the center of the topics they were discussing. It was always really in the thick of things. So, what are some helpful examples that you can give globally about what we're seeing protectionism versus more open borders? How is anyone doing things differently or similarly to the US, I suppose?
It's very interesting actually, because immigration and the kind of economic impact of immigration does sit very squarely in the center of most socioeconomic policies the world over. Um, Now, Emma, you're really good at these sayings, and there's a saying that I always misquote about the wise person or the kind person or the generous. I can't remember what it is, but they plant the tree under which they will never sit in the shade. I.e., there's kind of policy needs to be put in place to provide sustainable solutions to the socio-economic issues of a country for generations to
The
come,
future. Yeah.
um, and there's a little bit of an argument there in terms of immigration policy, because in the UK, for example, we've had a new administration under
Yeah.
Prime Minister Starmer and the Labour Party, and there seems to be the push to address or reduce net migration by making it easier and better and more welcoming for domestic workers, for those
Yeah.
who are resident workers, for British, or one of a better word, British nationals to fill those roles. And so there's been a lot of talk about workplace policies and education and training. Now, for those of us who've been doing this for as long as I have, we've been saying for years that the way to tackle the reduction of migration is to invest in education.
Right.
And we have had in the UK apprenticeship schemes and levies put to employers who want to attract migrant or foreign workers. But this is a long-term
Yeah.
strategy. At a point where, as I said earlier, 14% of the nation believe that there should be no immigration at all. So
Right.
the Starmer administration really finds itself at this kind of philosophical junction between acknowledging the need and the very real need to address skill shortages, whilst
Hmm.
at the same time looking toward encouraging a greater amount of investment for resident workers. Now,
Yeah.
if you think of it again, that in itself is one enormous global mobility policy, because
Right.
that's what
Yeah.
most organizations try to do in terms of their work. But then if we look at other parts of the world, Denmark has taken almost an opposite approach, addressing shortages by offering automatic 3-year job seeker
Hmm.
permits for migrants. There has been the example of across the kind of African nations of looking at greater cross-border collaboration and similar
Yeah.
kind of easy visa pathways.
Yeah.
On the flip side, we have Saudi Arabia and most of the nations in that Gulf area looking at policies to make sure that resident workers, and they're usually called ization, Saudiization, Emiratization,
Yeah.
mandating that the private sector have a certain percentage of
Their own
workers
nationals. Yeah.
who are nationals.
Mm.
The interesting one for me will be Canada. I spent most of 21, 22, half of 23 saying, Canada has the most progressive immigration policy. It was dealing with the aging population and skill shortages by opening its borders. And we're seeing a little bit of a backtrack of that as
Yeah.
in this latter half of 24 and certainly into 2025. I think what the kind of global lens is saying, rather like a mobility policy, anything is possible and nothing makes sense. We're looking towards a turbulent time
Yeah.
of there will be change and some of those norms will be disrupted. And I think a lot of that goes back to the outcome of 61% of those who could have voted in that super election year. There is
Yeah.
palpable need for change, be it,
Right.
and you can argue this for hours whether or not it's a need for change that has been conflated by social media or by the mainstream media or whatever it is. Governments are reacting to the mandates they have been given by the electorates.
Right.
And
And
I
I think
think we're going to see more of that.
a lot of that on the ground is the feeling of inflation, even in places like the US, where actually it came
Mhm.
greatly under control. Just the sense of over time, the fact that it's still much more expensive to buy standard products, and people feel that. And on a
The
day-to-day
carbon
basis,
event
they care
argument.
more about that
The
than some of the big
absolutely.
philosophical questions. Like you said, it's hard to imagine the shade of a tree that you're planting right now. I always think about it. I certainly don't know the specific phrase, but I always think about it in regards to cathedrals. People of the medieval period who built cathedrals knowing it would be 3 4 generations, and that it was worthwhile to do it now for the future. I think it's really hard to make people think about that future, which we know about, the definite, the skills shortage looming that we will talk a little bit more detail about later.
Mm.
I mean, we need to have talent coming in. It can't all be, with our aging populations, it can't all be domestic. It can't all be just educated and upskilled. But the feeling on the ground is so against it that it's almost like working against your own best interests.
We live in a world of immediacy,
Yes.
and I think the political will now is to respond to an immediate need.
Yeah.
For us who deal with kind of migratory policies that go back, and I'm not talking a long time, or relatively speaking, 1971. If you're looking at the migratory policies, that we are feeling the impact of some of those policies now, and the benefits, dare I say,
Right.
that I
Yeah.
think we sit in a world that spins on a different axis. And so
Yeah.
for mobility professionals, it really is a case of preparing for that whole manner of change. As you said, the businesses are thinking in different ways about how they operate. So we have to be agile, and we have to
Yeah.
be in tune with that, and we have to respond to that. And in some ways, I think we're going to be making a lot more immediate decisions,
Yeah.
to
I
respond to
think you're so
immediate
right.
business needs.
And I love that metaphor you used, a nationwide mobility policy. That's what we're looking
Mm.
at. But then when you go back down to the micro, the clients we're talking to every day, yes, they know that they need to be moving people for their future business needs. But the person who's in that hot seat right now needs to cut costs, or they need to
Yep.
deal with an immediate challenge of getting a group of people out of a geopolitical hotspot, something like that.
Part of our,
So
sorry, go ahead, Emma.
yeah. No, no, absolutely. Go ahead.
Part of our 2025 and beyond strategy is exactly that. A lot of
Yeah.
mobility professionals at this moment are scratching their heads to say, how can we build long-term, and I'm talking small s sustainable, but long-term sustainable mobility policies
Yeah.
when we are in a period of governmental flux wherever we are in the world, and the business is saying we need to reduce costs. All of
Yeah.
those three things, they don't always sit as great bedfellows. So it
Right.
is time to listen to the experts, to start to plan and to think. And you'll hear this a lot from me wherever I am in the world. Think of 2025, but importantly, think of beyond. And that's what I'm asking mobility professionals to do.
Good philosophy. So we've already touched on geopolitics a little bit. Let's expand into this a bit more. Um, we said, a lot of the changes we're seeing aren't just to do with the election rhetoric and the campaign promises, but this overall shifting geopolitical landscape that you've talked about. I mentioned, I think we've seen some sectors pulling out of hotspots. We have some people with less assignments into China, maybe moving towards other APAC hubs in case, depending on what industry they're in. Some more so than others that might feel the burn if something happened politically. And we've seen, I think you also mentioned some, minimum wage thresholds for visas around the world, and some
Mhm.
clients not being able to bring in lower cost talent for those more manual jobs. Like you said, the idea of encouraging companies to hire local or increase pay for those people who are being transferred, morally fantastic. But as I said, purse strings are tight. It's potentially changing the nature of global talent models and whether people are bringing folks in or not. So, what's your perspective on how immigration is changing to suit maybe geopolitics as a sort of spin off from that political year?
I think immigration, and immigration policy is always a reaction to the geopolitical climate at
Yeah.
any given time. If you go back to the very early stages or the very early phases of migratory policy, and I'm talking kind of for the US Ellis Island days, and
Yeah.
and if you go back to when immigration law was codified, it is innately discriminatory.
Mm,
And one of the things that you have to consider when you look at the wider geopolitical landscape is immigration is going to react to the relations between countries. So we have the renaissance of an east-west divide,
yeah.
and be that in trade tensions, be that wherever you find that geopolitical friction, immigration is going to react to that. So there are questions around the legitimacy of executive orders, not just in the Trump administration, but just orders throughout governments who are looking to respond to immediate geopolitical issues by banning migration, be it in the short term, and we saw that in the previous Trump administration, the Muslim bans, and that conversation has reared its head in a very quick and unique way. Closing the border is always a solution to a problem where you are looking to the outside world or the issues in the outside world to fix the problems that you have inside the border. So I think immigration policy is going to react to this changing geopolitical landscape. Now we're seeing the tensions between US and China. We have seen this week the tensions in trade tariffs between Canada and Mexico, and the fact that it brings instability for organizations. Tariffs are imposed and at the 11th hour lifted or temporarily suspended. How can organizations operate in a way where we have such a globalized economy? And I think that when you start to look at immigration policy at a governmental level, it will always react to those tensions. Businesses are always going to be caught in the middle. Tough decisions about how and where to invest, where the workforce should be placed, even down to if you have long-term mobility policies, how useful are they given the shifting sands of a political discourse? Bilateral agreements, we've seen them being torn up this week. We're also seeing new partnership agreements, UK, Taiwan partnership in renewable energy. These bilateral agreements, they essentially drive innovation. Some might say progress, and some might say they start to tie the hands. So immigration policy that's aligned to bilateral agreements will be considered good and bad depending on where you sit on the discourse.
Yeah, absolutely. Another interesting element that you sort of made me think about, I know we're going to dive into it a bit more lately, but I think it's such a crossover. We have to at least bring it up now is risk preparedness and crisis management in some of these global geopolitical shifts, the conflict and so on. So I've seen it and a huge surge across our clients to at least have contingency plans in place. And a lot of that is the immigration elements. It's not only how to communicate, how to make sure we know where your people are, which was the the COVID challenge, knowing where your people were in the world as well. But where can we get them to based on their unique family situation, their passports, where the safe pathways, which countries are opening their borders, which are not, in case of this type of an emergency. And that means preparing for the geopolitical emergencies and conflicts, which of course we're seeing more on the ground, but I think also, sustainability issues, environmental crises, so on and so forth, or another pandemic potentially. It's something that will fall on mobility and on a nuanced understanding of immigration options. So I think companies, at least many of them, are looking at planning for that in advance.
We had, and I mean, if you look back at those particular things that have happened that have impacted mobility, COVID was the leveler. If we go back 10, 12 years prior to COVID, you're looking at the Icelandic ash cloud, which disrupted.
Try and say that volcano name. That's your tongue twister for today.
I've never been able to.
Never good.
It's one of those things that I always pause and think, should I bring this up? Because I cannot say that.
Someone's going to challenge me to this. No. I think most of us can't. Yeah.
But if you think about it, that disrupted supply chains and the movement of peoples around the world. We had SARS before COVID. COVID was the one that shut down the world. It did give mobility that place at the table. And when you start to think of repatriations, that is something that mobility has always had to be involved in, predominantly around conflict. And what we're seeing now is the advent of new types of immediate repatriations that do not exist solely and squarely because of conflict. Now,
Right.
I trained under one of the most incredible immigration lawyers, Julia Onslow Cole, who really did spearhead and lead the way in moving people out of areas of conflict when it occurred, and being kind of the first in to make sure that those corporations, their employees, were safe. And I think the mobility industry owe huge gratitude of debt to Julia for the work that she did there. We all have to carry that on as well, and make sure that mobility policies are in place to, again, this word agility, to be agile to the changing world. And forget
Just
elections.
rest on your laurels.
Absolutely. Forget President Trump, forget Prime Minister Starmer, but just think about making sure that your policies can expect the unexpected. It's a huge ask.
And that's partnering with immigration partners, because it's moving so quickly. I don't know an organization that has an up-to-date, informed and everything globally, internal team that can handle the pace of change.
No.
So that is about partnering well and making sure those communications are happening smoothly.
And I think it's why we're always so happy to join you, Emma, and to partner with Sirva, because relocation itself is not just about getting people in, it's about getting people out. And I think when you look at all of those organizations that form part of mobility's relocation strategy, be it a tax provider or social security provider, relocation, goods, all of those things really do have to work harmoniously to get it right when someone is relocating in, but equally have to work harmoniously when you are extracting people.
And almost more so, because that's when people are panicking. And when people are panicking, that's where making sure it runs smoothly.
Back to that word immediacy. Immediacy used to be it wasn't the norm, and as I say, I can think of those conflicts where when I was a young immigration lawyer, we would be trying to deal with people getting out of areas of conflict. It was always very immediate. I think now the immediacy has gone beyond conflict and looks to the world around us at a time where climate agreements are being torn up, where there are serious questions on sustainability. So again, we are charting uncharted territory here. But we must do so as a harmonious community.
Yeah, absolutely. So with uncharted territory, we are heading that way, skills crisis wise. So that's a good segue from me. But we've talked about it, we've sort of dropped it in enough because it's such a central element of global talent strategies and of immigration. So there is an aging population issue, a looming skills and talent crisis. Some of this new UN data, it really highlights how huge this issue is. So 2/3 of countries are below the fertility replacement rate of 2.1 children. So they say by 2100, not even that far away, that tree would already have some shade, that cathedral would already be built. Some major economies will fall by 20 to 50%. So that may also mean that more than just that aging population dropping out of the workforce, we're looking at many of working age also being pulled out of the active workforce to maybe be carers of that aging population. So we've already mentioned it seems like a bit of a contradiction to be shutting down borders or stifling immigration when this is the need. So what are your thoughts on the immigration's role really in the skills crisis?
It's a fascinating question, because if you look at, as you've said, at the end of this century, we will have economies falling by up to 50%. By mid-century, we're going to have a talent deficit of kind of 80 plus million around the world.
Uncharted territory.
The two really do not compute that we have a huge talent shortage looming in the immediate future, relatively speaking, with economies really being impacted by it in the mid to long term future, and yet such incredibly populist protectionism. What I'm seeing worldwide is the flip side of immigration policy. And I always talk about this, the revitalization of economies by using immigration pathways. Japan is a great example of this, dealing with aging populations in that way. But then some other countries, particularly in APAC, Malaysia, looking to this too. I think the issue that we have here is it really does depend on the political will, how much you can use immigration to revitalize your economy.
Yeah.
However, that's why immigration exists in terms of what we do, in terms of the
Yeah.
global migration, the movement of skilled people around the world. It is to contribute to the domestic economy of those countries that those individuals are traveling to. So I think where we sit is, again, on the cusp of a philosophical debate on how much immigration will play a part in steering away from that global skill shortage, steering
Right.
away from the destruction of economies due to low fertility and aging populations. In my mind, and you'd say, well, of course it will be, because you've been doing this for 25 years, but it's one of the key solutions to it.
Yeah. It is.
How much that's on the public policy platform remains to be seen.
Right. Especially as we see, the larger populations where the birth rate isn't suffering is, sub-Saharan Africa. But so let's work on upskilling
Absolutely.
there and then relocate them over with
I
bespoke
think,
visas. If you want to
but I
vote for
think
me,
it really,
PM, you let me know.
absolutely, but it really does lend back into that consideration that immigration in silo cannot
Yeah.
fix and provide a solution.
Right.
That it can certainly help address the issue, but education, upskilling,
Yeah.
apprenticeships, all of those things that for successive governments almost worldwide, there has been massive underfunding.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
this is an area where immigration and that together can help swerve some of the issues that we can see on the horizon.
Yeah. I think just as a quick segue before we wrap up, although of course I could talk to you all afternoon, um, I think there is an element that we've touched on throughout, with the crisis management, with geopolitics, and with attitudes in the political discourse around immigration about duty of care and employee safety, especially where if you're relocating someone to a location where there's been this really strong populist anti-immigrant sentiments that have been, all across the news. And there's this perception that if you have a foreign accent or you've come from somewhere else, that maybe you've stolen someone's job or their hospital beds or their school places, they might not get a warm welcome. And that's another challenge. Even if the visa situation is manageable, even if you can get them in, they may in fact feel threatened in that location or unsafe for some reason. So I suppose setting expectations, supporting with language or intercultural training could be sort of helpful ways to assist navigating that, especially at a particularly tense time.
Oh, well, I think it's time to tear the band-aid, or if you're in the UK, the plaster off. And I think it's time to say that mobility has always been very good at preparing culturally for a
Mm,
move.
yeah,
The anti-immigration sentiment within a country now must form part of that cultural training.
yeah,
Um, we have seen time and again assignees say, I didn't realize that I would be considered unpopular for
yeah,
being here. And I think mobility has always done really well. And there are tools out in the market that you can get that gives you, do you tip in this, or do you add a gratuity to this, in this
right.
location,
Oh,
etc., etc.
tipping
Now we
culture.
have to think about the typical.
Yeah.
Just we could have a
Ugh.
podcast on that, but now,
Can we not? It's
I
so
think
stressful.
I know.
Yeah,
But we have to think about the anti-immigration sentiment in any
yeah,
location where you're assigning your employees. I think another part of this duty of care consideration is we are seeing wholesale tearing up of DE&I
yeah,
at a governmental level. Now, this is after progressive years of incorporating D&I into mobility policies, and even
right.
for mobility professionals in choosing their providers have
Yeah,
D&I as part of the procurement process. My
yeah,
question to the mobility community at the moment is, what is that kind of pan cross governmental approach to D&I change going to do to the policies that you have? It's
right.
a very difficult and emotive subject, but something that we should be thinking about now. Now, another thing that's very, very close to my heart is the LGBTQ plus individuals who are looking to leave
Yeah,
countries and who where they may feel unsafe, or they may feel there is growing there is growing distrust or disenfranchisement. Again, it's a mobility question that maybe we haven't had to think about before,
Right.
that we're going to be thinking about more now. The
Yeah.
world is spinning on a different axis.
It's
And because we, as a community, our playground is the global stage. So we have to acknowledge that different spinning axis and try to reframe how we behave and what we do to protect and sustain a duty of care to our employees and assignees. It's just
right.
really as simple as
Yeah, and I think it ties back in really neatly to what we were saying earlier, that immigration is fundamental to these business models' success, and so is diversity and inclusion, whether you call it that or not, whether it's an official campaign or not. The fact is that we need diverse perspectives. The data, the evidence is absolutely clear that that means you'll get better returns, better market share, better innovation, more agility. You need different perspectives to be agile, and that's exactly what we're saying is so important right now. And I think actively stamping that out would be detrimental to any global business. So I think it just needs to be done in a new way, but still I think companies really need to show their support. I mean, like you said, people, LGBTQ folks leaving, particularly trans people in the US, who just are no longer recognized as a gender that they are. There are places where it's illegal for them to go to a bathroom of their choosing, where they might get beat
as,
up in the other one. So it's
as an
definitely a time to
immigration
consider leaving. Yeah.
well, as an immigration practitioner, when the order on the gender identity came out, that one of the first things that we had was a U.S. Immigration attorney, a renowned U.S. immigration attorney, saying, "What does that mean for people who are out of the country wanting to return? The fact that
Right.
we're talking about citizens in this way,
Yeah.
and passport control forms part of the immigration debate, and
Yeah.
and so it really is a very live and very real question that we have to
Mm,
treat sensitively and remember that at the end of every passport, at the end of every visa and every work permit is a human being.
yeah. Ooh, it gave me
And that's,
shivers. Ooh, it's
but
poetry.
it is
Yeah.
ultimately that is what we all need to remember in
Yeah.
everything we do.
Right.
It's why I came into this industry, because I love to work with people.
Yeah.
Um, and you look at the thousands of people that we support every year. At the end of every single piece of paper we push across our desk is a human being, and that's
Yeah.
important to remember.
And more so, you're giving them the opportunity to meet human beings from a whole different part of the world, to like, open their eyes and change their
Absolutely.
horizons. So it is pretty magical, and it's scary but interesting what's happening. And certainly, we're at the crux of it. So what I'm going to do is try and wrap us up here. I think overall, what I've been hearing today. I mean, I love the think about the human at the end of every paper trail in immigration. Anyone who thinks of it as a compliance topic and not one that has a strong human element, to reconsider that, hearing your words. But also, we've been hearing how in flux the immigration landscape is. Perceptions, practicalities, they're complex, they're even contradictory. We've seen a lot today. And I would, re-emphasize that it's more important than ever to be agile, like you said, and to partner with your immigration providers to stay on top of all that. But before I let you go, I'd like you to share a top tip. What do you have for our listeners, Ray?
We held a client advisory board where we gathered some of our clients together, and I'm going to listen to them rather than giving you
Okay.
my tip. And I think that the tip that they said was to remain astute, remain agile, and keep close to your advisors. And I
Mm,
really do believe it is the time for us as a community to collaborate, partner, show respect to each other,
yeah,
to go through 2025 and prepare ourselves for the beyond.
amazing. That was brilliant. Whether your words or someone else's, thank you, Ray. It was such a pleasure to have you on our show again. And for our listeners, thank you for listening to Sirva Soundbites. If you enjoy our show, please click subscribe and share, and be sure to come back next time. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop us a note. Until then, this is Emma and Ray, and don't forget, Sirva provides everything needed to move talent and deliver experience. See you next time.